read a book on raising funguses. They're talking about French truffle finders.
All right, welcome to episode 47 of Farm to Markets. Coming up, we're going to discuss if bonds are still a safe investment, if nuclear power is going to make a comeback, and we have more lightning round questions at the end. A number of articles have been drawing attention to how poorly the bond market has been performing this year. Some going as far to say that the bond market is currently collapsing. Currently, the Vanguard long-term bond market index is down about 13% year to date. Drew, does this mean that bonds are no longer a safe investment?
I wouldn't say that bonds were ever a safe investment. I think that saying that bonds were ever a safe investment is kind of a broad overstatement. I would say that bonds are different and that they make a great diversifier to a portfolio. I think oftentimes people associate stocks as being aggressive and risky and bonds as being safe and stable. And together they create this perfect portfolio. And that's true to some degree. Certainly if you live in Pleasantville, this is how your portfolio would always behave. But bonds carry risks too. They're just different risks from that of stocks. I'd compare the safety of stocks and bonds kind of like the safety of skydiving and deep sea diving. Both can be great when things are good, but both can have bad outcomes for different reasons. For example, you're not going to drown while skydiving, and it doesn't matter if your parachute doesn't open when you're underwater. When it comes to bonds and bond funds, look at them like milking cows. And I'm probably stealing your thunder down on this one. This is kind of your analogy, but when you buy a bond, you're after the milk. You don't really care about the price of beef. All you do, you buy a cow and it gives you 5 gallons of milk a week. And you don't care if you fetch a handsome price when the price of beef goes up. Now, remember, bonds are extremely sensitive to interest rates. If you buy and sell bonds or bond funds before maturity, you're going to experience a change in value when interest rates change. This is exactly what's happening with the bond market right now. Bonds can be less volatile in a sense, as long as you're buying quality and you're not selling before maturity. So I guess to sum up the question, I wouldn't say they're safe. I would just say because interest rates are going up, the price of bond indexes are going down. And that's completely natural.
Yeah, so I'll just reiterate a lot of what Drew just said. When interest rates rise, existing bond values tend to go down. So it really depends on what kind of an investor you are. If you're buying a bond with the intent on holding on to it until maturity to get all those interest rate payments, then it doesn't really matter all that much what the value of the bond does, because you're going to get your money back at the end of it most of the time, plus you're going to get all those interest payments. If you're looking to buy it for a short period of time and then sell it on the secondary market, I would probably be considering bonds simply because we're looking at probably later this month, the Federal Reserve market expectations are that they're going to do something between a 75 and 100 basis point rate increase, which means any bonds that you buy before then will probably go down in value. Market is also expecting another one potentially in August, another rate increase in August. Whether that happens, we don't know. But we're looking at least maybe another 150 basis points potentially in rate increases. So if your intention is to buy those bonds to make a little money now and then sell them, probably not a good idea. But again, just to go back to what Drew was saying earlier, if you're looking for interest, let's say you're a retiree, I guess as long as you don't think that CPI inflation, which is currently 9.1%, is going to stay that high for a long period of time. If you think it's going to regress towards the longer term average, which is around 3.25% to 3.5% annually, if you think you can get 4 or 5% on a bond, a long-term bond, and that's going to be the long-term average for inflation, then sure, why not? If you think it's going to be 9-10% inflation for the long term here for at least the next 5 to 10 years, who knows? Currently, there really aren't any bonds that are giving you real positive rates of return. So sometimes that's better than losing 15%, losing real 5%. But so it really just depends. As of right now, though, I would say probably avoid them until at least the rate increases seem like they're going to be done.
This is why people make money in the market, is because it's all trying to determine what's going to happen in the future based on what signals we have today. When you say are bonds a good idea or are bonds safe? Well, geez, what is the definition of safe, and how long do you need that safety? Right now, the 30-year Treasury is paying 3.173%, which means you're going to make 3.173% on an investment today for the next 30 years. But you can buy a 1-year Treasury bill, which has exactly the same guarantees, except that you only get that cash flow for 1 year, and it's 3.18%. So you're actually getting a little bit more interest on a 1-year Treasury than you are if you lock your money up for 30 years. Well, what they were seeing here is the market believes that inflation is not sticky. If they believe that inflation was going to be around for a long time, we'd see the long end of the curve. We'd see those 30-year interest rates going up and up and up, because nobody would buy them if they thought that inflation was here to stay, because they just buy the 3.18 ones. So there's certainly risk, because all of our, the investors who are betting that inflation won't stick could be completely wrong. And if you do exactly the same thing they're doing, well, you're going to get hosed. When you buy a 30-year bond, what you're really doing is you're buying 60 semi-annual cash flow payments. And when the 30-year Treasury is paying 14% on $100,000, you're making $14,000 a year or $7,000 a payment. But if that same $100,000 is invested at 3%, you're only making $3,000 a year or $1,500 a payment for 30 years. If interest rates go up and you locked in at 3%, you could see your bonds actually drop more than half in value. You could see if it goes from 3% to 12%, you could see your $100,000 bond worth around $28,000. Now, to Drew and Alex's point, you're going to get all that money back by the time you, in 30 years, just like you're guaranteed. But in the meantime, all your buddies are making 14% of their money and you're only making 3%. So the best way to handle that kind of risk is buy a little bit of each. Buy some short-term bonds, medium-term bonds, long-term bonds. It's been a long time since I bought long-term bonds for all the risk that you gentlemen have suggested. But years ago, when I first got in the business, somebody came in with $1 million. I'd put 350,000 of it in laddered bonds and CDs. I'd have a 1 year, a 2 year, a 3 year, and I'd ladder that bad boy all the way out for 25 years. And as that 1 year came due, I'd buy another 25-year bond. And when the 2 year came due, I'd buy another 25-year bond. So the cash flows were consistent. Even people who are in their 80 years old would be buying 30-year bonds, because we'd be locking in for their family to get those kind of good rates too. Unfortunately, I've been doing this for 30 years, and all those great returns of 30-year bonds have long since matured. So, but there's a place for bonds. You just got to do it wisely.
This is why people like Nassim Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan, which I think is a really good book, hates standard deviation, because people think that bonds are a safe investment because of their lower standard deviation, like relative to stocks. But what they ignore is the outliers in the standard deviation, which basically make all the normal distribution in that standard deviation like almost irrelevant. So is that you go through periods where bonds are not very volatile, and this is where they get their basically their safety rating. And then you have a few periods where they are down like 13%. I would argue that this isn't necessarily a black swan event, because as soon as we started doing things like quantitative easing and really pushing down the short-term interest rates, it's like somebody pulling back on a rubber band. At some point, the interest rates are going to come up. We've been through rising interest rate periods before, so we kind of know what's going to happen. And there was a bunch of people out there predicting this kind of stuff probably for the last 5 years. And obviously nobody can predict what's happened because they kept kicking the can down the road. But now we're at the point where we're starting to let the tension off the rubber band, and you're starting to see a sell off in the bond market. So so certainly bonds, they certainly have they get the stigma of safety because they go long periods where they don't move around very much, but they certainly in the past have been down like this before. So historically, with the bond market being down like about 13%, right now it's about the third worst bond market sell off since going back to the 1970s. There's been at least like 1980, the bond market was down about 13%. In 2000, the bond market was down about 16%. 1995 is down about 18%, and then 1984 is down about 20%. So we certainly have seen sell-offs in the bond market before. They just happen with like really long periods between them. And then when investors are trying to explain bonds to people, they're like, oh, well, they're the safer investments. And historically, they do the opposite of stocks. So they get this idea of safety when really, they have their own risks associated with it. And then lastly is that investors are learning that there are no safe investments. Is that right now you can't put your money in cash because of 9.1% inflation. Bonds are down 13%, stocks are down about 20%. Gold hasn't really done anything and has been flat to down. So right now, there's really it's hard to be an investor because just about everything you put your money in, you're losing it somehow. And it's kind of a wake up call for people over the last 10 years, especially who've just started investing, to realize that there really is no safe place for money. Everywhere has risk, and that's why we constantly tout the mantra of diversification.
Mhm.
All right. Since the Fukushima disaster in Japan, nuclear power has been on the decline. However, with high gas prices and demand for clean energy, some are now arguing that the future of energy is again nuclear. Drew, what do you think?
I think if we pooled all of our global energy options and we could draw on them whenever we liked, I certainly think that nuclear energy would be a big player, if not the most major player. I think in the abstract, that more nuclear energy makes sense. I would argue that nuclear energy can be cheaper, more renewable, more consistent, and maybe even greener than solar and wind energy. But it's not like we can just turn up nuclear energy production whenever the gas tap gets expensive for consumers. Nuclear and energy are political fighting words. On one hand, wind and solar energy are far more land intensive than nuclear energy, and they require huge expansions in our energy transfer infrastructure. On the other hand, right now, nuclear energy still poses some danger and produces some waste products. It also comes with a high upfront infrastructure cost. So I think the future of nuclear energy will be determined more by Washington and less from consumer supply and demand.
So my position currently is in the near term, don't bet on nuclear just yet. Europe has spent a lot of time years offlining nuclear plants to bring on quote unquote green energy, which is often more carbon intensive than nuclear is. Germany's kind of led the charge on this, France to a lesser extent. But now that there are energy problems in Europe, you would think, well, nuclear is going to be a bigger part of the mix. Well, not necessarily, because the Green Party in Germany has one mantra above all else, and that's no nuclear ever. And so they've decided that it's better for the planet, apparently, and for Germany to bring on coal-fired power plants rather than bring nuclear power plants back online or expand them. Austria basically just followed suit. France is looking to bring some recently offline nuclear reactors or scaled down reactors back online, as they expect to lose about 25% of their natural gas supply, which is supplied by Russia. That said, here on this side of the Atlantic, the Biden administration has done very little to advance nuclear. They paid some lip service to it during the campaign, but we're still not seeing much of any action. from them. States like California are actively trying to turn their nuclear plants offline. And like thorium reactors or these small modular reactors are getting cold shoulder from yet another presidential administration. So in the short term, I think everybody is still laser focused on let's expand with wind and solar. Problem is that those only work really well in certain parts of the world. Germany is not one of those places, and basically outside the Sun Belt, solar is kind of worthless in the US. And in a lot of places, wind power is also a NIMBY issue like nuclear is. So I think they're going to continue banging their head against the wall until they just can't anymore when it comes to green energy. And then, and only then, will, I think, a lot of the environmentalists have to be ignored or be willing to go nuclear, especially if they actually believe their own rhetoric, which they say climate change is an existential threat to our species. Well, nuclear power is basically like non-carbon power, and none of the other power sources that they've promoted are doing much of anything to increase power supply, and they're busy blowing up dams. So I don't, if they actually believe that we're all going to die very soon, nuclear is really the only viable in the near term. But again, I wouldn't bet on it until basically there is no other choice.
That's the issue, is that eventually there will be no other choice. And places like California and Texas who have thrown their lot, well, it's not really necessarily all their fault. When you get federal policy encouraging people towards solar and wind to the demise of carbon-based energy solutions, then and you get rolling blackouts like we see in Texas and in California. Eventually, politicians are going to run in front of the parade that is moving the fastest, and people are eventually going to get tired of these rolling blackouts. They're going to say, geez, I remember when I was a kid and we used to have energy all the time, and I want to go back to those days.
Yeah.
And they're going to elect the people who come up with the policies that give them energy that's reliable and inexpensive. The issue with energy, whether it's nuclear, solar, wind, we don't really see their problems until they're ubiquitous. When rich people were using whale oil, it really wasn't a problem until technology got the price of whale oil down to the point where the middle class could afford it. And it's the same thing with oil and gasoline, is that when only the wealthy could afford it, it really wasn't an issue. It's just when the poor and middle class started using it in large amounts that it became a real impact. Solar and wind, we're only seeing the edges of their problems because they really haven't filtered down to the point where the poor and middle class can afford them. Once the whole planet is covered with windmills and solar panels, we're going to start finding out how much we don't like solar and wind. And eventually we'll move to nuclear power, and it'll be the same thing. We haven't invented all the other uses where we can waste energy, but once we have so much energy that was produced by nuclear power, you're going to see technology to just suck energy, and we're going to still demand more and more and more. Then we're going to start seeing the real problems that nuclear energy provides, and then they'll just have to come up with something else.
I would say that without better safety precautions, you're probably not going to see a return of nuclear power, because the past is basically going to repeat itself. Is that you're going to get nuclear power plants, something bad is going to happen, and it's not like when the Exxon Valdez spills oil in the ocean, and you have all those people out there cleaning oil off of baby ducks, and you get some environmental damage and stuff like that. The radiation stays around for a long time. I mean, like a long time. You get like radioactive clouds that are pushed across the Atlantic and all kinds of stuff. I mean, it's bad. When you have a nuclear accident, it's bad. And not only that, you have nuclear waste that you can't just I mean, it sits in like cement cases for centuries, and just causes all kinds of issues, and even erodes the cement casing in it. So I mean, you have a lot of green energy checks a lot of boxes on a policy standpoint. It's clean. You're not drilling for for oil. It's consistent. But the waste products, and the fact if you ever have some sort of like accident with it, I mean, those are serious serious consequences. I see why people are starting to think about nuclear again, because essentially policy wise, if you're not wanting to increase the supply of oil and other stuff, you basically got yourself in a knife fight in a phone booth, because there's really nowhere to go. Kind of like what Alex said, is that solar and wind only work really well and are only really reliable in certain parts of the country. And if you're going to the Saudis, and they don't want to increase their oil supply, and you're trying to get the price of oil down, or the price of gas down at the pump, then you're limited in options. But even if you do decide to go nuclear, it's not like you can just decide, all right, we're going to switch to nuclear energy. Is that it takes a long time to develop plants, and because since the decline of nuclear energy after the Fukushima accident, is that you've lost a whole generation of skilled labor that knows how to run a nuclear plant. For instance, people who do like welding for nuclear plants is like a highly specialized skill, and you don't have a lot of people who can correctly weld nuclear equipment, because there hasn't really been a demand for it. So you're going to have to train like a whole new generation on how to operate nuclear plants, and that's going to take a really long time. So in my opinion, I don't think nuclear is going to make a comeback.
These discussions about nuclear reminds me of the discussions we used to have in the Marine Corps between the uses of chemical and biological warfare, weapons, because we'd sit around and discuss, and should we have rules of law of land warfare which prevent people from using biological weapons, which have a really, really ineffective casualty rate, but we're going to continue to allow artillery, which blows people to bits. For some reason, we're scared to death of dying by bio agents, but for some reason, getting killed by shrapnel, somehow we accept. It's kind of the same thing with nuclear. Is yes, they're really nasty, and they don't come across well on the news channels when we actually have these crises. But compared to what? That's the big thing about economics, is everything's a trade-off. Is the odds of an actual nuclear meltdown is relatively remote, and when we have them, they are horrible. But are they any more horrible than when a refinery explodes, or when hundreds of people die because they don't have air conditioning in Los Angeles when they have a rolling blackout? I say eventually we're going to find that nuclear power is a lot safer than people actually realize when you actually look at the statistics. They just don't play well. Just like biological weapons and chemical agents scare the living daylights out of countries, shrapnel from artillery is every bit as dangerous. But for some reason, we like that, just like we like gasoline in our cars, even though it's extremely volatile.
Yeah. Well, I just want to play off that a little bit. I looked up the numbers, and I think the World Health Organization says that they believe that from the burning of fossil fuels for power generation, it's something like 3 million people each year globally die of health issues related to the emissions of those power plants. And there haven't been 3 million casualties of a nuclear accident, of all the nuclear accidents combined, not even close. So if we're just talking about like how many people is nuclear going to kill, it's not even close to what the global health officials say burning fossil fuels does. And that's, has nothing to do with climate change. It's just, all the particles that cause upper respiratory issues or whatever. But again, it's, everybody's kind of afraid of nuclear because nobody really wants to melt to death, I guess. They'd probably rather cough to death than melt to death. So to an extent, I can understand it. But even still, we're just talking raw data. Nuclear is far safer and far less deadly for the global population than fossil fuels.
Yeah, I think I'm one of the people who suffers from the heuristic of placing a greater amount of importance on the thing that's least likely to happen. Because when I see a nuclear disaster on TV, or you watch K-19, The Widowmaker. Have you ever seen that movie? I don't want to die by nuclear accident. I'd rather like slowly breathe in like carbon dioxide particles than be sitting at somewhere like melting. So I don't know. It's up to you, I guess. It's probably better for the environment.
I drive a car. and it doesn't bother me, yet I still eat cheese. I'm more likely to die from heart-related illnesses than I am from a car, statistically.
Statistically, Drew is the healthiest person I've ever met in my life, so I don't think Drew's going to die of a heart attack anytime soon. All right, we're running out of time, so I'll move on to the lightning round. All right, the popularity of special purpose acquisition companies known as SPACs exploded in 2021, but has cooled recently in the wake of new SEC regulations. Do you think SPACs will retain their popularity going forward, Drew?
No, I think SPACs are dead for now. With the wind taken out of the sails of the economy and the markets, less companies are going public. So therefore, SPACs don't really have as a big of a place in the market right now. When the economy and the markets come back, I think SPACs will too.
Yeah, I agree. I think they are out of favor at the moment. SPACs this year have lost over 50% of their value from their highs at the end of 2021. So it's been very rough if you've invested in SPACs. These are generally highly speculative investments that try and buy other highly speculative investments via IPOs. And when people are concerned about whether or not they're going to get a paycheck next, or whether or not they're going to be able to afford to keep the lights on or buy groceries, they don't generally engage in highly speculative investment. So I think they're out of favor and they won't be back for a while.
As long as we're in a money tightening environment, you're not going to see popularity with SPACs. SPACs are only popular when people have so much money that they use $100 bills to start their campfires. And that's kind of been the situation for the last 2 years.
Yeah, everybody was in highly speculative stuff, making lots of money, and then they got whacked, and now nobody has any appetite for risk. So yeah, I think SPACs are probably going to be cooling down for a little bit, even though they are more publicly available now. All right. A study found that exercise does not make up for poor diet. So according to the study, some had speculated that if you just exercised a lot, that would offset any poor diet that you had. And so what the study found is that's not true, and it's not true the other way, and that if you have a really healthy diet but don't exercise, the two don't offset each other. Is that in order to be wholly healthy, I guess, is that you have to exercise and eat well. Is this surprising to anybody?
Not very surprising to me. I always thought it was eat right and exercise, not eat right or exercise. I don't know who these people are that are trying to do one or the other, take shortcuts. It kind of reminds me of that scene from Pursuit of Happiness, where Will Smith is dressed as a garbage man and he's interviewing with the executives, and the person interviewing says, "What if a guy came in here with no shirt and I hired him?" And Will Smith said, "Well, he must have been wearing some really nice pants. It's not like you can just do one really, really well and it, more than compensates for the other. Do both, eat right and exercise."
So I was reminded by this question of something that I read, that Michael Phelps, the Olympic swimmer, is eating like 10,000 calories of nothing but like pizza and hamburgers while he was training. I can't imagine that that's his normal diet. He's just probably looking for calories. But no, in general, I'm not shocked. I can't imagine if you're eating a nutrient poor diet of nothing but, pizza or McDonald's and whatever, and yet you go for a 30-minute run every day, that you're still going to be fairly healthy, or vice versa. I don't think really anyone's surprised. Like Drew said, I had always heard get like 30 minutes of exercise a day, like 3 to 5 times a week, and eat a balanced diet where you get all the nutrients you need. So I guess some people need to be reminded, though.
When it comes to health, youth can cover up a multitude of sins. When you're 22, you can do just about everything stupid and still be in relatively good physical shape. But all of those bad decisions are cumulative. I remember when I was in the Marine Corps, and I have Marines who'd go and run the physical fitness test and get a perfect 300 point score. And then they'd start to break open their Lucky Strike cigarettes and start smoking as soon as they finished the 3-mile run. Well, now those guys are in their 60s, and the ones who are doing that, they're now feeling that impact. On the other hand, we live in a very health conscious place here in Montana, And I know 85-year-olds who are in great shape, and they eat right and they exercise and they live a happy life. I'd say there's one component that we need to add, and that's happiness. Is that at some point you got to find that sweet spot for exercise and nutrition and still be happy. Is that if you become a monk and you only do one thing or the other to an extreme, or both things to an extreme, and you sacrifice happiness, I think that could be detrimental as well.
No, just kind of say what Alex said is that when I wrestled in the 172 pound weight class, and I only weighed 150 pounds soaking wet. And so while my other, everybody else on my wrestling team was like starving themselves, I was eating like pizza and steak and doing whatever I could to get my weight up. So I just wouldn't get annihilated on the mat, and it wasn't fair. And if I did that now, I'd probably die. But we only got a couple minutes left. So the last question is that a study found that 7 in 10 people feel that a message, something like a text message, is not complete if you do not use an emoji. Are you one of the 7? Are you one of the 7 people that thinks a message is not complete without an emoji?
No, I'm one of the 3, but I found this question interesting because I realize 70% of my messages are probably incomplete to the viewers. I can't remember the last emoji I've sent. Sometimes I'll do the thumbs up. It's just a fist to reply okay, but I've never done a face. It's just not my thing.
Yeah, I don't think that they are incomplete without an emoji. When I do use them, the thumbs up emoji is definitely the number one. Very rarely will I do like an emoji face or something else. Audience dependent, I guess, but no, I don't think it's incomplete.
I'm a Neanderthal emoji user. Whichever is the most efficient, that's what I use. So like Drew and Alex, I use the thumbs up. I use the target emoji for you're right on spot, but lots of happy faces and lots of hearts and cute unicorns. I pretty much refrain from that kind of stuff.
I'm glad you do. Yeah. Sometimes I write a message and it sounds terse and I can't think of any other way to say it, but I'm not angry. I'll use a smiley face to let everybody know that I'm still happy. But most of the time, no, I don't use emojis.
Dad, if you ever send me unicorns and hearts and smiley faces, consider the message incomplete anyway.
Yeah. Something's yes, yeah. That's when you know Joe's been murdered. And somebody's just trying to find their
This is not you.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's it for episode 47 of Farm to Markets. We'll see you again next week.